In 722 BC, an Assyrian army invaded Israel. They captured the city of Samaria and led the people into captivity back to Assyria. Then they took people from Assyria and resettled them into Israel. They became known as the Samaritans. The possibility of those people ever returning to their homeland was a zero. It would be very difficult for slaves to leave their masters, travel hundreds of miles through robber-infested countries, and take back cities that other people were living in. These people are described as the 10 lost tribes because there is no record of them ever returning to their homeland again as a nation. A few years later, the Assyrians returned again, but this time their object was to take Jerusalem, and they aimed to do the same as they had done to the people of Samaria, take the Israelites back to Assyria and bring people from Assyria to Judea. If that happens, Jesus will not be born in Bethlehem, as the prophet Micah had predicted, because Mary and Joseph could be living somewhere in Assyria. Now the Assyrian army was the mightiest of the time. Humanly speaking, it was just a matter of time and Jerusalem would fall to them. This was a crisis. Something like a miracle had to happen to save the situation so Jesus could be born in Bethlehem, and a miracle did happen. In 2 Kings 19 we read, "The angel of the Lord went out and put to death 185,000 men in the Assyrian camp." I like what the King James Version says. "When they arose in the morning, behold, they were all dead corpses." The Assyrians, or what was left of them, broke camp and returned to Nineveh. In time, the Assyrians fell to the Babylonians. Enter into history Nebuchadnezzar, the great builder of Babylon. He did what the Assyrians had failed to do. He conquered Jerusalem and took the people, including Daniel, into captivity in Babylon. We are now about 600 years before Christ. But for Jesus to be born in Bethlehem, the people from Judea would have to return to their homeland, and they were still hundreds of miles away, captive in Babylon. But the Babylonians suddenly fell to the Medes and Persians in one night. That is when Belshazzar, king of Babylon, was throwing a big party, and the fingers of a man's hand wrote his last will and testament against the wall of his palace. That is where the expression, "the writing on the wall," originated. He got such a shock, the record says his loins were loosed. Some feel that expression means he didn't quite make it to the men's room in time, or words to that effect. God has some unique ways of humiliating the proud. The city of Babylon was surrounded with huge walls. The river Euphrates ran through the city. Massive bronze gates stood in the river to stop anyone from entering by it. But 120 years previously, the prophet Isaiah had predicted that Babylon would fall, and not only that, but how it would fall. The prediction was that the waters would be dried up and the gates would not be shut. And that is exactly what happened. The Persians diverted the river, which made it possible for them to enter the city via the riverbed. But the gates from the river into the city were miraculously left open. The Persian troops entered and Belshazzar was slain and Babylon fell, just as was predicted. But Isaiah also predicted the actual name of the Persian king who would conquer Babylon 120 years before he was born. His name was Cyrus, That is worth repeating. Isaiah, the Hebrew prophet, wrote that a king named Cyrus would conquer Babylon 120 years before he was actually born. That is absolutely amazing. But there's more, as Isaiah also predicted that Cyrus would set all the captives free, and that's exactly what happened. That seems the first time in recorded history to have ever happened, a nation allowing all their slaves to return to their homelands. But there's even more. The prediction also stated that Cyrus would provide the means for them to return back to Judea, adding not for price or reward, meaning Cyrus did it all for free, no charge. But not only that, Cyrus returned the sacred items from the temple that the Babylonians had taken when they sacked Jerusalem, such as the gold and silver dishes, bowls, and other items such as the 7 candles. So when the temple was restored, the worship service could resume as before. Had those items, and there were 5,400 of them, been lost, it would have been very difficult for the Jews to begin their religious rituals again. But the Ark of the Covenant was absent. It is assumed that it was hidden somewhere in Jerusalem before the Babylonians took the city. It has never been seen since, despite being sought for centuries. So, in the time of Jesus, the room in the temple called the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant used to stand, was empty. The Ark of the Covenant symbolised the very presence of God. On the top was a plate of pure gold called the mercy seat, with figures of angels at each end, with their wings stretched over the mercy seat. Their faces were turned toward each other, looking down at the mercy seat. They were looking at the Shekinah glory, a strange light that symbolised the very presence of God who dwells in the light. Below the mercy seat were the 10 commandments that God had given to Moses at Mount Sinai. The Ark of the Covenant symbolised that humans had broken God's law, but there is mercy for all who come into a relationship with God, and that is why the mercy seat is above the law. God is merciful to all those who seek him. But there's even more. Cyrus made a decree that he would supply the means for them to restore the ruined city and temple. So the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the temple was state-funded by the Persians as well. That decree is found in the book of Ezra chapter 1 verse 2, where it states, "The God of heaven has appointed me," that's Cyrus, "to build a temple for him at Jerusalem." In time, the Persians fell to the Greeks under Alexander the Great. It may come as a surprise to some that Alexander the Great is mentioned several times in the book of Daniel, not by name, but in symbols that obviously represent Alexander and cannot be anyone else but Alexander. An incident happened in the time of Alexander that again demonstrates God's care for his people. As Alexander was preparing to attack Persia, he had to conquer the great city of Tyre. They had a powerful navy that could disrupt the supplies to his army. Tyre must be destroyed. Alexander requested that the neighbouring nations provide him with supplies and troops. They all did, except the Jews. It was very dangerous to snub your nose at Alexander. There is what some say a legend that as soon as Tyre was taken, Alexander set out for Jerusalem with the intention of teaching them a lesson, which meant destroying their city and the people therein, as he had done with Tyre. The high priest took the matter before the Lord in earnest prayer and received a surprising answer. Open the gates of the city, and all the priests are to dress in their priestly garments and go out to meet Alexander. Alexander was welcomed into the city and told the high priest that before he set out on his conquest, he had a dream of this very event happening. Priests dressed in white walking out of a city to meet him. He claimed that he was told to treat these people with respect, which he did, and because of that, some feel that the legend may be true, as it is also mentioned by Josephus as well. In time, Alexander died, and his kingdom was divided into a number of divisions. His generals fought until there were just 4 divisions. Then the focus turns on just 2 divisions described as the King of the North and the King of the South. Syria was north of Israel and Egypt to the south. Then a number of years later, the focus turns to Syria, north of Israel. Enter into history Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, king of Syria. You may have heard the expression, a line in the sand. I understand that it originates with this king. Over a period of years, Egypt and Syria had been at war, but Egypt became very weak. Antiochus saw his opportunity and set out to invade Egypt. But Rome wanted control of Egypt too. Antiochus was met on the shore outside Alexandria by a Roman official. He told Antiochus to desist his campaign against Egypt. Proud Antiochus said he would confer with his generals. The Roman drew a line in the sand around Antiochus and told him to make his decision before he stepped out of the circle, or he would be at war with Rome. Antiochus was not prepared to go to war against Rome, so deeply humiliated, he set out back to Syria. On his way back, he took his frustrations out on the Jews. He set out to accomplish the ultimate solution, the entire destruction of the Jewish religion, and to convert them to Greek thinking, and he had the means to do it. 41,000 foot soldiers, 4,500 cavalry, and a number of war elephants as well. The Jews were practically defenceless. Antiochus had all scriptures burnt. Jewish festivals were banned. He defiled the temple in Jerusalem by sacrificing a pig on the altar. He erected an idol of Zeus in the temple. Anyone found with a portion of scripture or a Jewish symbol died in the most terrible manner. This was the greatest threat to the Jewish religion and nation they had ever experienced. The Egyptians enslaved the Jews too, but this was not over a religious issue. It happened that nothing could stop this king destroying the people of God. So it looked like the birth of Jesus might not happen after all. But God had just one old man. But one man on God's side is greater than an army on the opposition side. His name was Matthias, and he lived in a small village of Modin, about 30 kilometres from Jerusalem. The Syrians would go through Israel and force the people to sacrifice pigs. a detachment of Syrian soldiers came to his village and demanded they make the sacrifice. Matthias, in righteous indignation, killed the Jew who was about to make the sacrifice. That event triggered an uprising that led to the freeing of Israel against seemingly overwhelming odds. After the victory, the Jewish patriots cleansed the temple, and that event is still commemorated in Israel to this day in the feast of Hanukkah, mentioned in John chapter 10 verse 1. Jesus attended that celebration. We are now about 160 years before the birth of Jesus. This brings us to the period of Roman occupation, and just before Jesus was born, Augustus became Emperor of Rome. Prior to Augustus, Rome was involved in many conflicts and disruptions in society. He put an end to them and ushered into Rome what is referred to as the Golden Age, an age of relative peace which lasted some 200 years. So when those angels sang peace on earth at the birth of Jesus, it was really true in Roman society as well. But Joseph and Mary were in Nazareth, about 100 kilometres from Bethlehem, and the chances of them travelling that distance with Mary in her condition was indeed remote. Jesus may not be born in Bethlehem after all. Enter the taxman. Augustus decreed that all the world shall be taxed, and just in time to fulfill of the word of the Lord written 700 years before, Joseph and Mary arrived in Bethlehem with just hours to spare. King Herod was the last one to try to annul the plan of God, and he had the means to do it too, but his plan failed as the Magi, being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, returned to their country by another route. Someone has described this as the drama of the ages. But there's even more. To do his work, Jesus would need to be protected from the Jews. Anyone who opposed the establishment as he did, overturning the tables of the money changers in the temple, labelling the leaders as hypocrites and snakes, would have experienced a hasty end under a hail of stones. But they were now under Roman rule, and they couldn't put him to death. Just when absolute power was needed to protect Christ and the early church, the Romans arrived and took away the power of the Jewish leaders to apply the death penalty. If I had been living back there in those times, I probably would have asked God what he was doing. We're supposed to be your chosen people. You promised to protect us. We trusted you, and look what's happening. We're under the power of those idol-worshipping pagans. But God was doing exactly what was needed. And it's the same in our lives, friends. The greatest compliment we can pay the God of heaven is to trust him despite how things look from our limited point of view. There are 5 centurions mentioned in the New Testament, and they all get a good press. They're the good guys. They often protected the early church members from those who wanted to silence them. The first person to recognize Christ to be the Son of God at the cross was a Roman centurion. The Romans were great road builders. They built a vast network of roads to make travel safe throughout their empire. And over those roads, the early Christians were able to take the gospel to the outer limits of the empire. Without those roads, it would have been much more difficult. The Romans tolerated no opposition. They swept the pirates from the Mediterranean and bandits from the land, which resulted in safe travel. So the early church would be able to take the gospel message to all the world. The great event of the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem is mentioned just once in Scripture by a not of royal birth, rural dwelling Hebrew prophet. But just once was enough, and those proud nations bowed before it and crept away into oblivion. Notice how this is born in the great nations we have considered that attacked Israel. Assyria crushed the northern kingdom of Israel, but its capital, Nineveh, was so completely erased for centuries it was doubted that it ever existed. Babylon destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. The ancient city of Babylon has been a heap of ruins for centuries. The Bible predicted that Egypt, the superpower that enslaved Israel, would be the basest of kingdoms, but it was not to disappear like Assyria and Babylon, and indeed that has been the case. The empire under which Antiochus Epiphanes attacked Jerusalem lost its identity and disappeared. The great empire of Rome, which destroyed Jerusalem in AD 70, lost its power and eventually ceased to exist. But Jerusalem, despite being completely destroyed twice and attacked probably more times than any city on earth, still stands on the same spot it always has done, and the Jewish people are found the world over. Today it seems that even notable leaders of nations handle the truth very carelessly and often about current events. But by comparison, Bible writers are proved accurate to the detail about future events and over a period of centuries, as we have just seen. It seems to me the Bible has a stamp of authority about it and is worth believing.